In our episode revision 13, we will revise deficient demand and excess demand. Deficient demand means where the demand is less than the supply, and excess demand means where the demand is more than the supply in an economy. Now this is very important because we need to answer certain questions based on these two topics, the deficient and the excess demand. For this, the understanding of the graph is very important. Now, in any economy that is working at equilibrium, we know that AS will be equal to AD, and that we find at this point E. At this point E, we find that the economy is working at full employment level, which is shown by OQ. This OQ is full employment level of income. All right. So, what does this full employment level of income mean? It means that all factors of production are fully employed and all those who are willing to and able to work at the prevailing wage rate are employed. Now, when we talk of employment, we also talk of unemployment. Not all people, because we are talking about those who are willing to and able to work. So, those who are able to and willing to work but do not want to do anything, they will come under voluntary unemployment. But those who are willing to, able to work, but not able to find work for themselves is called involuntary unemployment. So generally these are asked when a question on deficient demand or excess demand is asked. So what is voluntary unemployment or what is involuntary unemployment, most importantly, is asked. However, we are talking about the income and employment. But the equilibrium level of output may not be true. That means the output may be more or less than the full employment level of output. So, if the aggregate demand is less than the output, it would lead to deficient demand. But if the aggregate demand is greater than the output, then there is excess demand. So, there is nothing called equilibrium level of output. It can be more or less than the full employment level of output. So, here in this graph, if this is equilibrium point, then to the right of it, we find the aggregate demand is lesser than the aggregate supply. So, here we find the aggregate demand to be less than the aggregate supply. And to the left of this equilibrium, we find the aggregate demand is at a higher level than the aggregate supply. So, here we find the aggregate demand to be greater than the aggregate supply. So, here we find deficient demand and here we find excess demand. So, let's understand this better. A deficient demand is a situation where the demand is not enough to employ all factors of production. Right? That is called as the deficient demand. Now, when the economy is working at full employment level of income, we find the level of income will be OQ. So, the corresponding point on the aggregate supply line where we find the equilibrium will be somewhere on this aggregate supply line, right? That is over here. So, this is the equilibrium point, or let us call it the full employment level F. Okay. So, at this point, what is the aggregate demand? The aggregate demand will be given by this AD line. So, at F, it is full employment. The resources are fully employed. All those who are willing to and able to work are employed. Now, we are talking about deficient demand. This should be the demand in the economy, but if the demand falls short of it, then it would mean that the actual demand in the economy lies somewhere here. All right. So, then the new demand curve will be given by somewhere here parallel to the aggregate demand given by AD1. Okay. So, let's call it G. Now, the actual demand in the economy is G over here, whereas it should be F, that is at full employment level. Now, the demand falls short of supply by this much. This will be called as the deflationary gap. Okay, and this leads to a fall in prices of the goods and services, because the demand is less and the supply is more. So when the supply is more, the prices will fall because there will be a stock of the inventory, the piling of the stock of the inventory. All right. Now a new equilibrium is established at this point, and then the income falls to, let us say, M. So now the income will be OM for the demand at G. Okay. So to increase this gap, or to get back to this equilibrium, an additional investment has to be made, which will be equal to this deflationary gap. So that much of investment will have to be brought in order to increase this aggregate demand. So what are the measures or remedy for this, to tackle this deflationary gap? The fiscal policy brought out by the government is to increase in the government expenditure. When there is an increase in the government expenditure, there will be more personal disposable income, and so the aggregate demand will also increase. The second one is decrease in taxation. When taxes are reduced, both direct taxes and indirect taxes, it will ensure greater purchasing power and then help to increase the aggregate demand. The monetary policy that is brought out by the RBI is to reduce the rates to increase the money supply in the economy. In the banking chapter, we learned how this money supply is increased or decreased in an economy. The monetary policy says reduction in rates to increase the money supply. That is the bank rate, the statutory liquidity ratio, or the CRR, repo rate, reverse repo rate, reduction in the margin requirement on loan, etc. This would increase the money supply. When the money supply increases, the aggregate demand automatically goes up. So that is how we can combat this deflationary gap in order to attain the equilibrium level of output also. So the questions that are generally asked is, what is deficient demand, or what is deflationary gap, and suggest one or two fiscal measures or monetary measures to combat this situation. So that is the most important question under deficient demand and deflationary gap. Now let's get into excess demand and inflationary gap. In an economy that is working at equilibrium, OQ is the level of full employment, where the output, where the income is to be determined, right? So if the equilibrium level of income or output is more than the full employment level of income or output, it will be due to the fact that the aggregate demand is more than the level of output at the full employment level. So this situation is called as the excess demand. Okay, so this would give rise to an inflationary gap. Why? Because the demand is more than the supply. So there will be an increase in the general price level. This we call as inflation. So now if OQ is the equilibrium level of output, then what is the demand? It will lie somewhere on the AS line over here, like this. This we are calling as equilibrium. Let us call it full employment. Okay. So at full employment, what is the level of demand? So let us say the demand curve is somewhere like this. This will be our AD. This should be the AD. But now the demand is more than this. So that means we are lying somewhere over here. This much of excess demand. So then the new demand curve will be like this, which is parallel to the previous demand curve. So let's call this AD1. Okay. So now by how much is it more? Let us call this G. So it is more by this FG. So this is called as the inflationary gap. Inflationary gap. Okay. So now when there is inflationary gap, it would mean that there is rise in the price. This rise in price level is because of the increase in the demand. So this would be called as demand pull inflation. To correct this situation, what should be done? The aggregate demand should be brought down to a level to reduce this deflationary inflationary gap. Okay. So by how much? By how much is the question. So what are the remedies to tackle this situation? Is a fiscal policy first, which is brought out by the government, that is decrease in the government expenditure, which would reduce the money supply in the hands of the public so that the aggregate demand goes down. Then increase in taxes reduces the personal disposable income, and so the aggregate demand will fall. And monetary policy that is brought out by the RBI, that is increase in the rates to reduce the money supply in the economy. Rates like bank rate, repo rate, CRR, SLR, margin requirement on loans, etc. When you increase these rates, the money supply automatically falls. So this would reduce consumption and hence the aggregate demand comes down. What happens when this aggregate demand moves up? A new equilibrium is established over here. So at that point where we have this new equilibrium, here we find that there will be an change in the income. Okay, so that is what. So what will be the impact of this excess demand or the inflationary gap on employment? Nothing will happen. No change in employment. Can there be an increase in the output? No, the output cannot increase because the economy is already working at full employment level. But what happens to income? See, there is a rise in price, there is inflation. So to combat that inflation, there will be an increase in the nominal income. There will be an increase in the nominal income because there is inflation in the economy. What will happen to the general price level? It will increase. The general price level will increase, and that is why we are calling it inflation. The questions that are generally asked under excess demand and inflationary gap is, what do you understand by inflationary gap? Suggest fiscal policy and monetary policy measures to combat this situation. So those were the questions that are asked. So when you write this answer, you have to draw this graph as well as write down the measures also. Let us also try to solve one numerical. This I have taken from some textbook. Here the numerical is the aggregate demand is given to us. Aggregate demand function is given to us. Aggregate demand function is equal to 200 crore plus 0.75y, right? And the full employment level of income is also given to us as 500 crores. Now we are expected to calculate the equilibrium level of income, and secondly, is it inflationary or deflationary, and by how much is the inflation or deflation. We also need to calculate the change in the investment that is needed to combat the inflationary or the deflationary gap. So let's try to solve this quickly. The first question asks us calculate the equilibrium level of output. Now at equilibrium, what do we find? AD is equal to AS. This AS is nothing but Y. So here in this aggregate demand function, we'll substitute this and write Y is equal to 200 plus 0.75 Y. Now from here we can solve Y. To find this Y minus 0.75 Y is 0.25 Y is equal to 200, or Y is equal to 200 divided by 0.25, which will be equal to 800 crore is the equilibrium level of income. Okay, but since equilibrium level of income is more than the full employment level of income, which is given as 500 crore, full employment level of income is 500 crore. So this will help us solve the second question, answer the second question. So here, what will be this difference? This is 800 and that is 500. This is full employment level. So this is equal to 300 crore, which is which represents an inflation. Why inflation? Why inflation? Because here aggregate demand, it shows 800. Here it shows 800 level of income, whereas this is only 500. Full employment level is 500. So there will be an inflation. So to combat this inflationary gap, what should we do? The income must be reduced by 300 crores. Okay, so from the aggregate demand function, we find that the MPC is 0.75, isn't it? So this will help us to calculate the third part of the question. So we find that MPC here is equal to 0.75, and the investment multiplier K tells us that K is equal to 1 by 1 minus MPC. Okay, so from here if you calculate, k will be 1 by 1 minus 0.75, and this gives us 4. Okay, this is because 1 by 0.25, and so it will become 4. Okay, we also know that k is delta y by delta I, and delta y we have found out to be 300, and k is equal to 4. So 4 is equal to 300. Since it has to be reduced by 300, we'll take this as minus 300 divided by delta I. So this implies delta I is equal to minus 300 by 4, which is equal to minus 75. So the investment must reduce by 75 crores to combat this inflationary gaps. So that's how you solve this problem. So what is very important over here is the graphs. From the equilibrium point, onto the right you have deflationary gap, onto the left you have inflationary gap. Okay, and the measures, the fiscal policy and the monetary policy measures to combat those two situations, these are very important. And one numerical as to how to solve this, I have shown you how to find the equilibrium level and whether it is inflationary or deflationary, and how to calculate this change in investment to combat the inflationary or the deflationary gap.